Thanks very much. So very glad to be here. I've been here for a week lecturing at the Wellcome Trust in the Phil, which is, for a budding neuroscientist like me, it's sort of like going to Mecca for a pilgrimage. There's so much exciting work and tools that have been developed there. Okay. My title is, as mentioned, Cognitive Neuroscience and Regulatory Paternalism, more or less. The more or less part means two things, which is, my view is that neuroscience hasn't directly had much to say about precisely what policies might work how, but is beginning to set the stage for saying more. And the rate of progress in the area is ferocious. So you'll hear more cognitive and less neuroscience. Maybe in the discussion we'll come back to additional things neuroscience has or can say. And another part of more or less is that it's sort of presumed that as we learn more about human foibles and human nature and mistakes, that'll invite more paternalism and more regulation. And that's an empirical question. It might involve less. There may be widespread types of regulations which understanding the brain better will tell us we should use less of, or we'll learn something about the limits on regulatory brains, which would move us in the other direction. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first few slides, kind of setting the stage and getting some basic language in the air about how economists of different types think about paternalism. So in neoclassical economics, as was mentioned, I went to the University of Chicago, where people take the theory as seriously as any place, although there are also people who look at facts, which is useful, can't hurt. And the presumption is consumer sovereignty, that consumers generally know what's good for them. And when regulators and others are trying to impose choices, they may be doing so mistakenly or without kind of honoring sovereignty. And a kind of consequence of this worldview is that the best consumer protection is self-protection and education, is for consumers to learn how firms may be trying to mislead them and what they really want. And what regulatory agencies can best do is to facilitate and guide that education, like subsidizing financial literacy and courses in high school and things like that. And I think that's a good starting point. But behavioral economics takes the view that some consumers, I should add citizens, regulators, and others, and business people, are sometimes limited in rationality and willpower. And the challenge is to see if we can be as precise as how those limits work and what regulations might help without causing too much harm. I should add, I haven't written very much on this, but other people who are good writers and very good behavioral economists have, which includes Sunstein and Thaler. Many of you know their book Nudge. And there's another book by Peter Ubel that's just out called Free Market Madness, which is a little bit more like Shove, is a little bit more aggressive about policy. And Peter is a physician and also kind of a behavioral economist, so his book is filled with lots of interesting facts and ideas. Okay, so I should add at the start that behavioral economics has become more and more accepted and piqued people's curiosity at every level, from undergraduate and graduate training into policy circles. But we used to have to defend it more aggressively, hopefully not so much anymore. But we see it as part of a natural progression in academic economics and economic theory of relaxing simple basic models which are useful up to a point, but outlive their usefulness and deserve expansion. For example, for a long time we studied perfect competition, which meant there are lots and lots of firms making the same thing, and competition will yield marginal cost pricing and will protect consumers because competition will include something like consumer protection as part of the package. In the 1940s, people began to then study imperfect competition like oligopoly and monopoly. Until the early 70s, economists assumed perfect information, which is great, but it leaves out all kinds of interesting things like knowing about product quality and knowing whether you can trust someone. And beginning in the 1970s, there was a revolution in the study of imperfect information by people like Mike Spence and Akerlof studying signaling and Lemons markets and things like that. And so we see behavioral economics as part of a natural progression in which perfect rationality and willpower has been a useful limiting case, but it's a good time, thanks also to the cognitive science revolution, to understand how to expand the theory to include limits on calculation, attention, and willpower. And I should remind you that even though I'll talk a little bit in examples about consumer protection and finance, really the big decisions that people and maybe their governments and families and communities need to worry about, I would say, the ones that are difficult, often are emotional and highly consequential, sometimes irreversible, for example. So if you make a mistake, you live with it forever, and your children do and others, involve categories like the following: credit and savings, houses and cars, consumer, long-lived durables, educational choices. If you have terrible grades in high school, that may handicap your opportunities in life for quite a long time. Choosing careers, addictions, childbearing decisions, and marriage and divorce, as well as health. So these are all domains in which people sometimes at very young ages have no chance to learn from trial and error, often aren't processing information maybe very thoroughly or making decisions others would regard and they may later regard as big mistakes. And these are where some combination of regulation and family encouragement and advice could help people. Okay. Let me remind you about the neoclassical arguments against regulation. This is part of the Chicago view. So one is that smart consumers police markets. So some combination of smart consumers and market policing will lead to pretty good outcomes. So where I live in Caltech is close to a neighborhood called Monterey Park, which is sort of a kind of free market attempt to recreate Taipei and Beijing. Lots and lots of Asian immigrants settled there. And the Chinese people take food very seriously, so bad restaurants just do not survive in those neighborhoods. You can find them in other parts of the world and Los Angeles. So there's a sense in which if you go to a restaurant that's crowded and there are lots of Chinese people there, it's probably pretty good. So the consumers are acting really like kind of food critic watchdogs, and the system works pretty well. One way this was articulated quite a while ago was by Alan Greenspan, who wrote the idea that businessmen, quote, would attempt to sell unsafe food and drugs, fraudulent securities, and shoddy buildings is a collectivist myth. It's in the self-interest of every businessman to have a reputation for honest dealings and a quality product, unless maybe you're making baby food in a foreign country, or you're Bernie Madoff, who seems to have not read this quote or forgotten. Part of the Chicago idealized view is that regulators, even if there is some challenge for consumer protection, which isn't policed by consumers or somehow supplied by market competition, regulators may not do a good job either. And here I think it's very important to note one thing economics does well is to study what we call general equilibrium, or you should think of as unintended consequences. So well-intentioned policies often have all kinds of unintended consequences which may create more harm than good. So a full analysis of nudges and shoves needs to really include working through all the ripple effects of what happens when policies are put in place. And in thinking about behavioral economics, that's something that's unfinished business for the most part. Finally, protection may create offsetting costs. That's part of the unintended consequences. So these are the arguments against doing anything new and different. 45 years later, Alan Greenspan said in congressional testimony, I made a mistake in presuming that the self-interests of organizations, specifically banks and others, were such that they were best capable of protecting their own shareholders and their equity in the firms. So this is kind of a remarkable admission. Collectivist myth, I made a mistake. Collectivist myth, made a mistake. Okay, so as was noted, this is sort of a good time not to sound too immodest, but recent events have, I would say, galvanized interest in the possibility that mistakes at every level of the economic food chain, from consumers taking out liar loan mortgages up to powerful investment banks disappearing, to think about the possibility that limits on rationality and willpower have something to do with what happens in the economy, and we can do something better. So the behavioral economics arguments are limits on rationality and willpower as noted. The mistakes we talk about are often systematic. It's not that half the people do one thing and half do the other and it cancels out. They're often large in scale. The idea that consumers may make small mistakes, but when they do things like buy houses, they switch into kind of a hyper-analytic, non-emotional Mr. Spock mode doesn't seem to necessarily be true. And the mistakes can be correlated across the economy. So part of the story in the credit crunch and associated problems was that because of counterparty risk and very tightly wound contracts and leverage, a few small mistakes became large and percolated across the world. And research in behavioral economics might suggest better protection of some form. That's the modest start. The simplest way, I think, to begin is what Sunstein and Thaler call libertarian paternalism. Along with several co-authors, we have also written about this under the rubric of asymmetric paternalism. What we had in mind was you can think of a few policies that help people who are prone to make big mistakes without imposing really any harm on people who are quite rational. And it's hard to oppose these. When we wrote about this, we said we sort of designed these things to be politically unobjectionable by people across the spectrum. And then, of course, on blogs, people said things like, oh, I object, I object. But the things we had in mind and talk about in our law review paper are things like cooling off periods for certain kinds of goods. Like in Berkeley, I think it's ballroom dancing lessons. If you buy ballroom dancing lessons, it's Berkeley, who knows? You have some number of days, like 3, to completely renege upon the contract. And the idea is if you're quite rational and have carefully researched ballroom dancing lessons and consulted your spouse, or more likely you didn't consult your husband and bought them anyway, the cooling off period doesn't impose much harm. You just have to wait a few days to start your lessons. But if you got kind of suckered into it or didn't think or didn't consult your spouse, you have a chance to completely change your mind at no cost. And notice, by the way, an important point, which is the presence of these cooling off periods takes the incentive away from firms to engage in high-pressure sales that are likely to be reneged. So not only does it protect consumers, it gives better incentives if you think that firms are kind of selling the wrong thing. And that's important too. Okay, a useful thing we should be thinking about is really one of the very first steps is maybe private mechanisms for protection and curing mistakes work fine. So here's a short list, and I'll say just a little bit about some data. One is personal learning. Many things we do by trial and error. As I said a couple of minutes ago, a lot of the things we're really most keenly interested in are things that you don't learn by trial and error, like important relationship choices, buying houses, career choices, early educational choices like college and graduate school, you really basically make once. But there's social learning advice, like learning from friends and experts. There's reputation and word of mouth about products. In some cases where millions of people are harmed in a small way by, say, a product misrepresentation, for example, the case like Blockbuster, which was charging sort of repeated late fees in a way that courts felt was kind of egregious. Nobody was harmed very much by paying a few extra dollars in late fees, but it was millions of people. And there we have mass torts and other legal systems and class action that are designed to kind of help. If the harm to any one consumer is tiny but lots are harmed, lawyers have a large financial incentive to bring these cases. And finally, media reporting in some cases can be a quite powerful mechanism. Luigi Zingales, who's a corporate finance professor at Chicago, has written some papers on this, and he finds that cases of widespread financial frauds seem to be what brings these things to light and offers some kind of cure, or at least gets them in the light of day, and sometimes lawsuits follow, is some combination of private whistleblowing, media coverage, and a little bit of oversight from the SEC. So the media often plays a big role in some kinds of transmission of reputations. Okay, here's a little evidence about personal learning, which I alluded to at the top of the list. This is data from David Leibson and some colleagues. They got a beautiful data set, which I'm very jealous about, of 120,000 credit card customers over many years, making 100 million transactions. And the beauty of the data set, besides the sheer size, is the length of the panel. So you can see on the x-axis of this graph, the account tenure, that is how long from the beginning, the time that the account was opened, how many mistakes people make in various categories. And we can debate whether these are actually mistakes, but these are fees which people generally wish they had thought ahead and been able to avoid, like late fees, limit fees of exceeding the credit limit, paying for cash advances. And the x-axis, again, starts at 4 months, or sorry, it starts at 0 and it goes all the way out to, I think it's about 6 years, 72 months worth of data. So we're seeing a long run of how people learn, not just in the first few months or an hour or two like we can do in the lab, but over 6 years. And what you see is they start out making about a third of a mistake per month. That's 4 per year in each category. So that's about 1 mistake per month in the order of 20 or 30 bucks. So that's kind of small, but when you start to add it up, it's substantial. But it drops off quite rapidly. And by about 3 years in, their mistakes are much more minimal. So there is learning. but it also doesn't asymptote at 0 except for limit fees. The others asymptote at about 1 mistake per year. They have another graph, which unfortunately I neglected to put up here, but which is very lovely, which is a graph of the same thing, which is overage charges and mistakes people generally wish they could avoid that are modest in scale but add up if you make them 12 times a year. And instead of this graph, it shows the mistake rates of people at different ages. And you get a beautiful U shape, very much like in driving accidents and lots of other things. And what happens is the young people make mistakes because they don't realize and they forget and they learn. And then old people make mistakes because they forget. Or maybe they don't care so much because a $30 error doesn't make as much of an impact. And if you look at this U-shaped bowl, there's a minimum, which they call the age of reason, which is 53 years old. And it's a fairly flat minimum. So if you're a little past, that's okay. And if you're a little earlier, younger like me, I have 4 more years of relative of learning to look forward to, and then it will just get worse. And notice, all the way, they estimate a very nice, simple reinforcement model, very much actually like the way we think about animal learning in neuroscience. And what they find is that people learn to avoid these mistakes at the rate of about 20% per year, but they also forget at the rate of about 15% per year. So that's very important. When in the Chicago School view that consumers learn and learn and learn, they usually don't include things like forgetting and this upturn in mistakes as people get older. And the full model needs to do both. Okay. So we can ask, without looking at too much data here, does competition effectively protect consumers? For example, in the previous graph, there has been a dramatic increase in competition of credit card companies on the basis of fees. So interest rates have gone down a lot. The days of people having 18, 25% interest rates are largely in the past, at least introductory interest rates. But competition in fees hasn't really kicked in. So the fees are effectively the profit center for a lot of companies, I believe. So yes, competition can work pretty well if part of what competitors can make profits from is luring customers away from bad products. So many of you, I'm not sure of the situation in the UK, but in the US, until a few years ago, you couldn't transfer your cell phone number, and service was horrible. I remember once going into Sprint, and I was very unhappy with their service, and there was a sales boy of age 17 or 19 or something, and I said, you know, your service isn't very good, you need to do better. And he said, well, I don't know what to tell you. And I said, I'm going to have to go to another company. And he said, oh, it's okay. Now cell phone numbers are portable, and service is terrific. A year or so ago, we wanted to change our service, and I called, and they said, oh, I have a much better plan for you. It'll save you a lot of money. And not only that, we're going to backdate it so it starts at the beginning of the month, even though it was the middle of the month. I was like, is this happening? It was exactly the opposite. And it had to do with the fact that owning your own number mean firms had to compete for your business. So as neoclassical and behavioral economists and everybody agrees, generating more competition is generally always good for customers and not bad for firms. I mean, it's not good for profitability, but it doesn't kill off good firms. The things that we think might limit the effectiveness of competition are things like status quo bias, kind of psychological switching costs, which we know a fair amount from behavioral economics about. Educated customers may be unprofitable. So if people think that active stock picking is really great and they found the best company to do it and it's worth paying a substantial amount of fees for turnover and stock picking, which maybe finance professors are skeptical about, then educating them that active stock picking doesn't work may not lead to much profit. Another problem is products are very complex. That doesn't mean, again, people are definitely making mistakes, but it does mean there's a cognitive challenge in choosing. Here's an example. These are 3 different memory things, and there's just a giant list of stuff. Notice they're not particularly standardized across, so you might think, gee, I should get the one with the longer list. But what happened is some company might have taken the long list and just added some junk on to make it look better. And I know a little bit about computers, but I have no idea what most of this is about. Also, as noted, there are a lot of, like in credit cards, there are a lot of businesses that have gone to a system in which there's a well-publicized low price, like for printers, and then a hidden fee, which is really a large part of the full price, like ink cartridges, which David Laibson and his colleagues have written about. And they're not picking on the printer business, they're just noting that it has that structure. Also, there's a lot of choices. This is, in economics, we used to talk about commodity products, and when students said, can you give an example of a commodity? We would say water, but no longer. If you go into even a medium-sized restaurant, there may be a supermarket, there may be dozens or hundreds of types of waters, different brands, shapes of containers, sizes, sparkling, not sparkling. These are mustards, again, which you would think there isn't too much scope for product differentiation, but there's a tremendous amount. So there's a kind of interesting debate. A number of psychologists have said there's too much choice, and when people have too much choice, they don't pick anything. For example, Sheena Iyengar at Columbia has worked on this, and they actually have data from things like employees choosing among investment vehicles at work, and they find that the more things there are to choose from, the fewer people choose anything at all, which is probably not itself a good choice. At the same time, stores that have lots of products don't go out of business because people don't walk in paralyzed and then leave. So it may be that with experience and learning, people do learn to have a favorite mustard brand, and different people learn to have different favorite mustard brands, and that's why this picture is of a company that exists. Okay, let me give a few examples now of what seems to work. And I think I want to suggest two kind of positive themes. These are, again, we don't have lots of examples on a full-blown theory. We just have some interesting suggestions with some empirical content. But one thing I think behavioral economics tells us is that incentives work, and changing prices of things does lead to consumer responses. But they often work in subtle and interesting ways with an element of psychological surprise that isn't part of the standard Chicago view. So probably the number one poster child for this is the so-called SMART plan. And the idea is Dick Thaler and Shlomi Benartzi went to some companies, or companies came to them, and they said, we'd like to get people to switch into these company-offered tax-deferred savings plans. How do we do it? And Thaler and Benartzi said, well, here's what you might try, which is tell people, if you opt into this plan, the next time you get a raise, we're going to take 1/3 of your raise and put it in this tax-deferred savings account. And over several years, you'll be building up where you're actually saving a fair amount. And the beauty of their plan was, and they told people, by the way, if you commit today, when your raise happens, maybe in June, you can always change your mind. So they exploited the fact that people wouldn't change their mind, they wouldn't get around to it. And the fact that when their paychecks show up in June, instead of the paycheck dropping because now you're taking something out of their take-home pay goes up a little less than it would have, which is an opportunity cost rather than a nominal drop. And so nobody complains. And it worked great. It raised savings rates in some groups on the order of 3% to 10% over several years. People are really saving a lot. Another kind of interesting example from Dufflo and Sayes is they sent letters out to people at universities and said, why don't you come to this benefits fair? There's a little booth on the way to lunch. And they found that the people who got the letter went to the benefits fair and signed up for all kinds of excellent tax-deferred savings plans. But in addition, people who went along with them because they were going to lunch together signed up for lots of savings plans. So this is one example of what we call peer effects, where if other people are doing stuff, that often has a substantial influence. And it's hard to ascribe that to the classic economic variables of information or price. It seems to have something to do with social networks and friend influences. And that shows up in lots of other things, including obesity and smoking. People lose weight and quit smoking kind of in a club. A third one is from Anna Maria Lusardi, which is very cute. She was interested in when people start thinking about retirement. And one of the things that gets people to think about retirement is when they have an in-law that's at retirement age. And the beauty of the in-laws is it's not genetics, right? If it was the sibling, you could say maybe there's some gene that at age 62, siblings start to all think about retirement. But the fact that it's an in-law suggests it's something like attention and emotion. It just gets in, it starts to get in their mind. There are a number of examples of where little postcard reminders help. There's some evidence from Africa, a brand new paper, that if you give farmers a subsidy to try using a new fertilizer, a very small subsidy works, provided they have a limited time to use it. If you say any time in the next year, they won't get around to it. If you say it has to be in the next month, they get it done. So if people procrastinate, you have to put deadlines on things. That reminds me of a funny story. I haven't seen any data on this. This may be apocryphal, maybe it's just a fictional example. But in most granting agencies, at least in the US, and I think in the UK, They invite academics to submit grants on a particular deadline. And of course, sometimes the websites get kind of congested with grants being sent in at the last minute at 12 p.m. the day before the grants are due. So one English agency said, it'd be much better if we smoothed out this process rather than having a big clump of grants at January 1st. So we'll allow people to submit any time they want. And you can imagine what happened. The number of grants plunged because people didn't have a deadline to force them to do it. And some of these are economists who are writing grants about how people don't procrastinate and don't need deadlines to organize their activity. But they didn't get around to writing the grant. Okay, a few more. I mentioned peers. I'm thinking of work by Nicholas Christakis and Jim Fowler on the surprising influence of peers. There's a new paper on subsidizing people going to the gym. It turns out if you pay them a little money to go to the gym once, they go. That doesn't have much influence. If you pay them $100 to go for eight times in 8 weeks, they do go. I mean, those who don't go don't get the money, but those who go and complete the regimen and get the $100, then go a lot more in the next few weeks. It seems to be you've developed a little bit of a habit that carries over. So another anecdotal reminder, I think this is data from my wife. After there was a 4.3 earthquake recently in LA, we ran out and got earthquake kits, right? So sometimes the reminder or nudge is not a nudge, but it's sort of an earth shake for 10 seconds. Here, I'm going to show you in a minute some data from a brand new study about AIDS testing in Malawi. And this is a reminder of two things, which is that incentives do make a difference. So behavioral economics, by the way, we don't deny that prices matter, subsidies influence behavior. It's often an issue of how much and what form the incentive comes in. It often helps a lot if it's sort of an immediate, like cash payment, or something that expires over time, like the example I mentioned. And so what Rebecca Thornton found was that if you go door to door in Malawi and do AIDS tests, and then to tell people you have to come and pick it up, we're not going to bring it to you. But if you do come and pick it up, we'll pay you a small sum to do so. On the left of the bar chart is zero, means no incentive. And as you can see, about 1/3 of the people came and picked it up. They also varied how far you had to travel to see the kind of travel elasticity, whether it was crucial for it to be nearby. It turns out it doesn't make very much difference how far away it is. So travel distance doesn't matter. And what's striking is that there is an incentive effect. So if you pay them about 1 hour's wage, which is 10 US cents, again, a reminder how poor Malawi is, then the rate of pickup of the AIDS test doubles to 2/3. And then after that, it goes up with higher and higher incentives. On the right-hand side is 30 times as high, so that's about a week's wages. And then they go maybe 90% of the time. So there's a slight upward drift, but the most striking thing is a jump from no incentive to some. A little bit of incentive seems to get people's attention. So it isn't necessarily the amount, but the fact that there's any incentive at all. And that's a very good, from a policy point of view, it means cheap little subsidies often go a long way because what they're doing is generating attention and focus as well as nudge. A final major comment, and then I'll say just a little bit about neuroscience and have one speculative suggestion. The natural instinct of many people, not just economists, but engineers trying to inform the public about risk, and some psychologists, is to just give people information and they'll know what to do with it. But increasingly, we come to think that information and helping people process the information are kind of complements. The form in which the information comes, whether it activates emotions, whether you hear it from a friend or peer, or whether you get a brochure with boring statistics and no pictures, the devil is in the details. And again, this isn't necessarily a breakthrough new idea from behavioral economics, it's just kind of applied psychology at work. So the suggestion here is, number one, public education of consumers is a good thing, particularly children and vulnerable groups, meaning maybe low income people we might classify as gullible in some either clinical or social way. Simple ideas work surprisingly well, like defaults and cooling off periods. There's some evidence, I have one paper on this, there's some evidence that if you standardize quality information like health rating cards, A's, B's, and C's, or labeling of salad dressing fat content, that does pretty well. What happens is, for example, in the fat content case, the salad dressings that have the least fat say low fat in big language. The ones that have high fat do not say high fat. They just say nothing. And that doesn't seem to completely work. One theory is that consumers will figure out if it doesn't say low fat, it means high fat. they don't seem to completely figure it out, because when you require mandatory disclosure, so that you have to put the fat content in a certain font, then the amount of fat content goes down. So consumers need a little extra help to realize that no news from companies about quality is bad news. But it's also very helpful that the quality information is standardized. Without standardization, it's sort of kind of impenetrable. You're back to the computer problem. And one simple kind of nudge-like suggestion is that regulators may be able to require companies to not necessarily provide consumer information, but provide tools with which consumers can wade through complicated decisions. So one example I heard of from Portugal was that there were phone companies were required to have online calculators. So when you're thinking about which minutes package to get, you could have type things in and choose relatively easily. And again, the idea is you're removing the incentive. If consumers make dumb mistakes by getting the wrong packages, you're removing, to some extent, that source of profitability, which is really just a transfer from people screwing up to corporate profits. It's hard to see why that's something that erasing that wouldn't be good for the world. Okay, finally, a little bit about neuroscience, the less part. What can neuroscience contribute? I think there's a long-run thing and then just a suggestion to kind of sharpen the point. The main thing is that I'm in the unusual position of having to undersell or behavioral economics in order to get you thinking about the benefits of neuroscience and other tools. But many of the things we've been studying for 10 or 20 years are not really well understood at the level of mechanisms. So some of the standard things behavioral economists talk about are loss aversion, a kind of disproportionate aversion to loss compared to gain. Is that like a phobia? People are too afraid of losses and that's a mistake we need to cure, or is it just a genuine component of preference, like what type of ice cream you like? Optimism, framing effects, and self-control. And these are things that we have simple little toy analytical models of, but are not really deeply understood at the level of mechanisms. And for example, something like self-control, knowing more about what brain areas are actually generating something we would call self-control, I think is necessary to go further and ask about individual differences in policies and whether they work. And also there are lots of things like genes, hormones, and pharmacological treatments which behavioral economists have not been studying, and how those things actually work in the brain is really the next frontier to think about behavior. Let me give you one example of loss aversion. So this is a study of capuchin monkeys. The monkeys are housed in here, I think at Yale, and they're in a cage, and they get 12 little plastic tokens you can see in the front of that picture. So they go shopping for their food, and we can ask the monkeys shop the way humans shop. And they do in one interesting respect. So what the monkeys do is they come in a little bit hungry, and they're trained to trade these tokens for little slices of banana and grapes. And seller one, let's say in red, offers one banana, but half the time adds another one. Like, oh, for you, my friend, an extra treat. So the result is that if the monkey shops from the red seller one, she gets either one or two with equal probability. And they do this lots and lots of times for months, so they really get used to the process. Seller two offers two at first, takes one away half the time, and kind of cheats you. And if you think monkeys are loss averse, and their point of reference is what's in the hand of the seller when they walk to that side of the cage, they should really hate having one taken away by seller two, because that's a loss. And they should kind of appreciate having one added by seller one. They should shop at seller one's shop more often, and they do about 70% of the time. If you compute what we call lambda, which is the degree to which people dislike losses dollar for dollar compared to how much they like equal-sized gains, a kind of kink in a utility function for those of you who know the technical things, you get a number around 2.7, and most human choice data, including things like from game shows where there's lots and lots of stakes involved, deal or no deal, on which there are many studies, you get ratios for lambda around 1.5 to 2 or 3. So that's it. This is not neuroscience per se, but it is sort of biology, because we're looking at cross-species, and then that invites speculation about cross-species mechanisms. And the answer is that loss aversion seems to have some degree of cross-species universality, which is a big clue about whether we should treat it as a mistake and so forth. Not that it necessarily works exactly the way, say, in humans and monkeys, but the tentative evidence is that there's some kinship. Okay, finally, I'd like to suggest something neuroscience might be able to do with help from basic cognitive psychology and cognitive science, which is to rethink a welfare standard. So in the Chicago view, welfare is an economist term for what's good for people. In the Chicago view, and there's a particular fundamentalist view that people actually forcefully articulate, welfare is whatever you pick. In a world of consumer sovereignty, especially with fully informed consumers, if you picked it, you like it. And this extreme view doesn't allow much room for slippage. So that's one standard of welfare. A neuroscientific standard, or a cognitive one, may be the following, which is what I would call a thoughtful choice. So the idea here is that a good choice for you is one in which relevant information is seen and processed. And relevant might be things you say you would like to know about. It might also be things I nudge you to consider without being too heavy-handed and sort of insisting that you do so, but I want to present it to you. And it seems to me that if one chose to, someday you could develop a kind of cognitive and brain definition of what a thoughtful choice is. For example, think about contract comprehension. Somebody's looking at a long contract, and we could say, if you haven't looked at the contract, we don't think you're making a thoughtful choice. And we can measure with eye tracking something like looking. We can say, if the next day you don't recall some basic details of the product, of the contract, like the price or the interest rate, we can say maybe you didn't study it carefully enough. We could ask quizzes and so forth. What I have in mind here is something between informed consent and medicine, where we want to know people have really thought through the consequences of an operation, and something like driver's license tests, where you have to actually pass some kind of quiz to be able to go out on the road. And again, this is just a speculation. Nobody has done that in exactly this way, although people have developed things like tests for financial literacy, but they haven't suggested using these particular techniques to go a little further. And the beauty of this, again, is it's intended by me in this simple sketch to be an aspect of libertarian paternalism or asymmetric paternalism, in the sense that if you're really good at reading contracts and you know all about things, this won't take up much of your time. Everyone, the idea is the quiz would be quite simple, so everyone would design these. And so two people might be unfairly burdened, which is those who are extremely well informed, but they'll be fine, they'll pass the quiz, and those who are making snap judgments. And that's exactly who I think we would like to reach and force them to reason more carefully, like this person here, which is Britney Spears. This is a picture of her first husband, whom she was married to for 55 hours. So I suggest that some kind of a thoughtful judgment standard would not have made her life much worse and might have made it a little bit better. And it seems in any kind of practical implementation of this idea, highly experienced choosers, for example, if you're somebody who's your commercial real estate and you've dealt with thousands of commercial real estate contracts, well, you might not want to apply the same standard of contract comprehension. So you could have some process by which experienced choosers opt out, very much like with driver's licenses. In California, if you've had your license for a certain number of years and you don't have too many accidents, you can just apply by mail and you get a new license. You don't have to take a test after a certain amount of, you get immunity after a certain while. How would the neuroscience help? This is two snapshots from a recent study we're working on. In this study, we're interested in hypothetical and real consumer choices. Hypothetical means they see pictures of products and they're asked, imagine you could buy this for the price on the screen. Would you buy it or not? And we started studying this because people often overreport purchase intentions, just as they overreport intentions to vote and intentions to go to the gym next year and intentions to do virtuous things. And we're interested in whether we could see a different neural signature for hypothetical choice and real choice. So later in the experiment, when they're in the scanner, we kind of surprise them and say, remember those things you've been looking at? Now these are real choices. When you come out of the scanner, we're going to start you off with $50. If you say, yes, I want to buy this, we're going to actually order it for you, take the price out of your money, and you're going to get this thing in the mail. And what you see is, at the top, you see the overlap in brain activity when the choices are hypothetical versus real. Hypothetical is in red, real is in yellow, and the overlap is in orange. And what you see is there is some overlap. When they're thinking hypothetically, they're doing a little bit of the same evaluation, we think, in the medial orbital frontal cortex and in the ventral striatum, but there's extra activity for real. And the bottom slide shows you the differential activity in real versus hypothetical at two different levels of statistical significance. So these are the areas that are only activated in real, not in hypothetical. And you can imagine, again, you can only imagine, it doesn't exist, but you can imagine a test that would look at brain activity and maybe pupil dilation or a whole battery of things, and say, we think you've made a thoughtful choice because your brain looks like that you're taking this seriously rather than just winging it. Okay, and finally I'll end with a quote from Thomas Jefferson. When last year, 2 years ago, I was at the FTC and we were having a little meeting on this, essentially the same topic. And I had a day off when we went to the Jefferson Memorial and noticed this, in beautiful script, this quote from Jefferson, who said, I'm not, and this is me, or him speaking for me. Thank you, Thomas. He said, I am not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and constitutions, but laws and constitutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. And I don't think Jefferson had exactly in mind this meeting today, but what he had in mind is, as we learn more about human nature and what people are capable of, we should be adjusting our laws and constitutions, but not too frequently. And I think that strikes about the right tone, speaking for myself anyway, about where we are in this interesting topic.
Can I just start by kind of saying that the kind of defense of the kind of neoclassical perspective is that it does give you a single, simple, universal tool that you can use. And arguably all the insights that have come from behavioral economics, social psychology, other areas, give you a variety of very specific exemptions to that general rule, but they don't as yet come anywhere near offering an alternative, even more, even if it were more complex, but an alternative kind of holistic account of behavior. Is your kind of hunch that in the end all we're going to end up with is a much, much more complex and contextualized model of behavior, or do you think that actually one day we could come up with a new integrated universal account of what drives human decision making?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think first I would start by taking a little bit of issue with the claim that rational choice theory is sort of a unified theory. So Ken Arrow has an interesting paper on this from 1986, and he points out that most of the force of the theory in any particular application comes not from the idea that people have stable preferences and they're trying to maximize something, but from some auxiliary assumptions that are used case by case. For example, in the study of bequests, how much money people leave for their kids, and is it the same for different children, and does it depend on how often the kids visit them, we immediately assume a kind of basic within-family altruism. But in models of worker motivation, we assume workers have no altruism toward their employer, which is, so either that's contradictory because people don't change their hearts and minds when they leave the family and then go into business, particularly if they're in a family business. Now what? But those are both reasonable kind of stylized accessory assumptions which help explain some of the basic facts about bequests, which is people do leave money for their children, and facts about the workplace, which is workers often seem to exhibit not very much loyalty to firms, and they care about money and other things. So there is a core basic theory, but there is a lot of exemptions, as you said, or specialized accessories, depending on whether you're doing development economics or labor economics, health economics, and so forth. And behavioral economics in that sense, I think, is very similar. In a few areas, I think we've built up a pretty good parametric sense of how to extend the rational choice view with kind of one extra variable. Very much like how Newtonian mechanics works pretty well, and then when you're at unusually high speeds, different things happen. So in the realm of time discounting, the workhorse model economists used for a long time was that of exponential discounting, that you're applying a nice, smooth, exponentially discounting factor toward future rewards. That particular function happens to have one parameter, and it also has the property of dynamic consistency, which means if you plan to do something in the future, you're going to actually do it unless something else crops up. And now many people work with something called hyperbolic or a beta-delta discounting, where there's two pieces. The beta part refers to the kind of preference for immediate reward, but once we get past now, it's the same as old exponential discounting. And those models have the nice property that if you really believe in exponential discounting, you have to believe in beta-delta with a particular beta value of 1. So we have a very nice empirical showdown. You just fit the models, and if beta's 1 a lot of the time, we recant and go back to the old one. And if it's not, it seems to be in many, many data sets around 0.7. That suggests that there's some regularity in a two-piece model. And then the question is how stable those numbers are, and do they really hold across contexts and people and things like that. And in the area I've been working on most recently in game theory, and also some people at the Phil, we have models in which
people do some degree of strategic thinking, like in the so-called Nash equilibrium, John Nash of A Beautiful Mind fame, but not everybody thinks fully strategically about everybody else. So you get sort of a mixture of some people who are just kind of casual and don't think very carefully. But others know that there are people like that. And others know that there are people who know there are people like the casuals. And we have a kind of mathematical hierarchy of beliefs. And if that hierarchy goes out to infinity, that's the standard game theory case as a limiting case. So then we can kind of compare, in these examples I have in mind, there's almost always a set of parameter values in which full rationality is the standard case. And then we have a nice sharp competition. So in that sense, I think we're making progress by expanding the standard model in small ways. It's a kind of a minimal accommodation. But there are lots of other phenomena people have been studying which suggest we need to be much more radical about rethinking our notion of preference, and concepts like attention and memory and emotion are probably not going to boil down to little tweaks of this general model.
I think one of the objections, or one of the concerns to kind of libertarian paternalism, which I guess would have been really, those people who were predisposed to kind of that concern would have been really alarmed by your last slide and the kind of notion of people going through some kind of magnetic imaging before you could decide whether or not they could be allowed to choose a product. I know that's not exactly what you were saying, but before this mustard can be sold to you, we must see what part of your brain it lights up. But in a way, the question I wanted to ask was that, in a sense, got two parts, which is that you can use this information to shape government regulation, but you can also use this information to inform us of the mistakes which we are prone to make. And it seems to me that if you're sort of concerned about the state, either because you're concerned about authoritarianism or you're just concerned that the state tends to screw things up, you might prefer to say the great thing about this tool is it gives us good warnings. It kind of tells us what we should look for. By the way, I liked your low-fat thing. I remember Miles Kington suggesting once that somebody who'd been prosecuted for selling low-fat yogurt that wasn't had said that the reason for this was because the fat was low in the carton. So it's in a way one would be less concerned if this was information available to the consumer, so the consumer can make a more informed free choice. But that then leads me to ask, what is the effect of knowing about our idiosyncrasies on the choices that we make?
Right. So I think that quite a few studies beginning in the 70s and 80s studied what they call debiasing. So we did some examples of this, for example. So we had some experiments on self-serving judgments of fairness in a kind of simulated legal case. Actually, it was based on it was research with Sam Zakharov, who's a lawyer and behavioral economist at NYU. And it was an actual simple tort case where a car had hit a motorcyclist and the motorcyclist was suing for some damages. So he'd taken this actual case and stripped away the names and things. And we had people read the case, tell us what they thought was a fair judgment, list the crucial facts that they remembered, and negotiate for a little while. The longer it took them to come to a settlement, it was like legal fees. They got less money at the end. And at the end, if they couldn't come to an agreement, we had a judge who actually looked at the case and said, I would have awarded this. And that was what was going to happen in the experiment to the people. And this is a classic example of self-serving bias. So the people who were assigned to be the defendants, who didn't want the damages to be very high, they pointed out all the facts in the case that were favorable to them. Like, well, it's true that the driver in the case of the car had 2 beers, but that was an hour ago, And the motorcyclist had swerved a little bit into my lane and didn't appear to be injured and so forth. And the motorcyclist would look at the same facts. So they read the same exact case. That was the beauty of the experiment. So there was no question the information they were exposed to was exactly identical. And the motorcyclist had the opposite view. And also the difference between what they said was fair was highly predictive of how long it took them to actually kind of settle and whether they would settle at all or they went to the judge's judgment. So the first move we made was a debiasing move, which we wrote a little paragraph saying, in cases like this, people often think their own side's arguments are more powerful than the others. You should keep this in mind. No effect. And we think what's going on is part of the self-serving bias is a kind of optimism, like, oh yeah, I know everyone else is like that, but not me. So they were self-serving about their assessment of the extent to which the self-serving bias instruction applied to them. So that didn't work. Then we said to them, you should list all the weaknesses in your own case. That didn't work. we think what's going on is they list these weaknesses kind of half-heartedly, and they think, well, this is a pretty strong case after all. Now that I think about it, as if somebody else had listed the weaknesses objectively. What did work, interestingly, was as they're reading the case, this is not a very practical, but just to pursue this line of questioning, as they're reading the case, they don't know which side they're going to play. And as they're kind of absorbing the case facts, the bias doesn't seem to be entering. Of course, in practice, you couldn't really do this. You'd have to put them in some kind of role-free hypnotic state or something. But what that tells you is that the bias is coming in as they're reading and thinking about the case. They're filtering out the negative facts, and they really remember the important ones. So anyway, but there's a lot of other debiasing literature on things like hindsight bias and optimistic bias. Many people think they're above average. You should keep this in mind now. Do you think you're above average? Yeah, because all those other people are wrong. So straight debiasing doesn't seem to work very well. It be that something like what I had in mind with the neural picture and using eye tracking and contract comprehension and recall measures could be sort of advisory at the very least. It would be very much like a medical checkup. You would come in and say, I'm thinking of getting married, or I'm thinking of buying this house, and we go through some kind of battery. It says, I'm not sure you're really thinking this through because I asked you how many bedrooms it has and you couldn't remember, or I asked you what color her eyes were and you couldn't remember. I'm not going to, the state will not prohibit you from buying this house or marrying this person, but I would encourage you to think about whether this is a reasoned decision or something of that kind. And I don't know whether that would improve, and keep in mind, in some ways, this is what other things in the political economy, like friends and therapists and self-help books, may encourage people to do, and in some cases probably have some value, and like in cognitive therapy, we know often works for certain things. In other cases, maybe it's not powerful enough.